Orthodox day school and Orthodox yeshiva high school. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania, which is more or less a Jewish school as well. But towards the end of my college life and then in graduate school and law school, I fell away from the observant path and found myself becoming less and less observant.
I was a graduate student at UCLA in library science. I lived in a typical student apartment with thin walls. In the apartment next door to me was a law student named Cooperberg. This was in the days before cell phones and before portable phones, and my roommate and I shared a landline in the living room that was situated right in a little table immediately next to our thin apartment wall, which was right next to Cooperberg. I had a boyfriend with whom I was regularly breaking up and getting back together with. One night, unbeknownst to me, my neighbor, Cooperberg, overheard the following conversation between me and my boyfriend. "So, you want to break up? Well, fine, then this is really it." Clunk. The next morning, Cooperberg asked me to have lunch with him. I said yes. So I showed up at the appointed time at Cooperberg's locker.
Well, it so happens this fellow Cooperberg, who by the way his first name was also Joel, was a really good friend of mine in law school. He just happened to live in the apartment next to Fran, and that morning he said to me, "Hey Joel, do you want to have lunch?" And I said, "Oh yeah, sure." He said, "Why don't you meet me at my locker at noon?" So I said, "Fine." So at that time, I went over to my friend Cooperberg's locker. There was Cooperberg, and there was Fran. And then Cooperberg looks at his watch and says, "Oh my God, I have a class," and walks away.
Well, we had a pleasant lunch. It was a little awkward. Joel asked for my number, and because I wanted to show my now ex-boyfriend that I really meant business, I gave Joel my number. And also, he was cute. Joel invited me to his apartment for dinner. I thought this was rather forward of him. Just saying. But because I wanted to show that ex-boyfriend that I really meant business, so against my better judgment, I said yes. And also, Joel was cute.
Well, on the night of this date, when I was supposed to pick Fran up and take her to my apartment for dinner, I had a little errand to do first. There was a friend of mine in law school whose name was Mary Ann, and it was Mary Ann's birthday. And she had had kind of a tough life, and I felt really bad for her, so I decided that I would bring Mary Ann flowers first, and then I would go pick up Fran. Well, one thing led to another. I got the flowers, I got to Mary Ann's house, I was running kind of late, and some people in this audience may not believe this, but in 1978, when this story took place, there were no cell phones. And so I really had no way of letting Fran know that I was going to be late, and I was late.
Joel said he was going to pick me up at 6 p.m. So I was ready at 6:15, but no Joel. 6:30, still no Joel. As Joel stated, back in 1978, there were no cell phones. But, believe it or not, Alexander Graham Bell had already invented the telephone, the modern telephone with a landline. And believe it or not, there was also such a thing called a payphone back then, where people could walk over, put some money in, and call someone.
Now you tell.
He finally arrived at 7 p.m. and told me about his friend and the flowers. I had my doubts about this date, but I wanted to show that ex-boyfriend of mine that I meant business. And besides, Joel was cute. Joel lived in a seedy apartment in Santa Monica off Pico, kind of near McCabe's, if you know where that is. As we arrived, I noticed that one of the front units had a large flashing neon sign in the window that said massage. Real classy. When we entered Joel's apartment, the table was set. And so Joel opened the oven and proudly showed me our dinner. A giant turkey roaster pan, about this size, filled with tuna noodle casserole. Actually, Joel told me just tonight that the pan was larger than this. And then Joel explained to me how nutrition of food tuna noodle casserole is. It first contains all of the basic food groups. It contains the canned tuna, which is your protein, the cream of mushroom soup, which is your dairy product, your calcium, the frozen peas, which are your vegetables, and the carbs, which are your noodles. And that was all there was to eat. And that's all we ate. And as the evening ended, I thought to myself, this man needs a wife. Not me! But he needs a wife.
You know, there was another reason why I made tuna noodle casserole. I mean, sure, everything Fran said was correct. I did tell her it had all these 4 major food groups, very nutritious. Plus, I made a giant pan because I could eat it all week. For some reason, Fran didn't think that was very romantic. But I came to realize the real reason I made tuna noodle casserole was because, unlike me at that time, Fran was observant and she kept kosher. And I wanted to make something that she would be comfortable eating. And I knew she'd be able to eat a tuna noodle casserole. As time went by and I fell in love with Fran, I realized that I loved her not just because she was a beautiful woman, but also because she was a gateway for me, a pathway back to the observant life that I had once led, that I wanted to come back to. And it was the tuna noodle casserole, of all things, that pointed me back to finding something I didn't even know I was missing. Tuna noodle casserole, the food of love.
Going to recite a poem for you guys. What is a hero? A being supernatural or flesh and bone? Must they have capes and tights and galactic powers? Or will work boots, aprons, and pocket protectors fit the bill? Was Judah Maccabee more than a man or a mere mortal with a divine purpose? Hero, less than a deity, more than a sandwich. Summon the heroes.
So I'm supposed to make sure that I talk into the mic. I've been forewarned. So my father died almost 23 years ago. He and I were not particularly close. We loved each other. I loved him and he loved me, but we were not particularly close. In fact, he was not really what I thought of my image for the kind of father that I really wanted. He was short, he was not very athletic, there was no playing catch with him because he was from Morocco and he didn't know anything about baseball and thought the whole thing was kind of silly anyway. And he had this funny accent and he spoke 6 languages and he loved telling stories from any other language that he knew and translating them into English. And those stories just never sounded right. In fact, I was a little embarrassed by my father. And in fact, I'm a little embarrassed to admit it even all these decades later right now. But that's the way it was with he and I. I knew his history. His history was that he was born in Morocco, and that he had after World War II, he had gone to Palestine, fought in the War of Independence, met my mother, who was Canadian. They moved back to Canada. My sister was born in Israel. I was born in Canada. My brother was born in Canada, and then we moved here. Okay, and that was basically the story I knew. Now my mother, she died about maybe 13 years ago, so about 10 years after my father died. And in my mother's effects, we found this letter from a rabbi in Winnipeg, Canada, and he was introducing and recommending my father for a TV show called This Is Your Life. And for those of you that don't know about cell phones, I'm sure very few people here remember This Is Your Life. But it was a TV, who remembers it? Whoa, that's pretty good. But for those of you who don't, This Is Your Life was one of those really early TV shows. It was when TV was just in its infancy, and it was a story. They had a studio audience, and they had pre-selected a person out of the studio audience who didn't know they were pre-selected, I guess out of this same size crowd or whatever. One person had been, everyone knew it could be them, but everyone assumed it wasn't. And they would bring in the people, they would call that person up, the person would be in shock and all that, and they would tell something extraordinary about that person, bringing in the people that person had interacted with onto the show as the show went on. And it was very emotional, it was very touching, and that show basically was introducing an extraordinary person to the American and Canadian audiences. So I was wondering, well, wait a minute, I know about This Is Your Life, even though I just vaguely remembered it, but why was some rabbi in Winnipeg writing a letter about my father? What was it about my father that he was willing to take the time to write this letter and recommend him for a TV show about extraordinary people? So the rabbi's letter really added a lot of meat to the history of my father that I really didn't know. Yes, he was born in Morocco, in Casablanca, in 1913, but what I didn't know is that during the time that he was growing up, he was a leader in the Moroccan Jewish community. And so that when World War II did end in Europe, the senior leaders in Morocco, the Jewish leaders in Morocco, picked him as one of the several representatives that they would send to Palestine as being the first Jews from Morocco to go to Palestine. And that was in 1945, and he was 32 years old. He did fight in the War of Independence, and he became one of the first police officers in the fledgling Tel Aviv police force. Meanwhile, my mother was born and raised in Winnipeg, Canada, but she was a Zionist. She was single, she was a Zionist, and she had been watching the news very closely, and the minute the state of Israel was declared, she jumped on a bus from Winnipeg to New York City and on a boat from New York to Haifa. And she wanted to be part of this new nation. She had friends in Israel, people that she had been connected with, and she was headed to one of them for a Shabbat dinner that she had been invited to in Tel Aviv, and she couldn't find the street, so she asked a policeman for directions. And that policeman was, of course, my father. And 3 months later, they were married. Now, interestingly enough, my mother spoke English and Yiddish. My father had not yet learned English. He spoke Hebrew, Arabic, and French. So they really did not have a common language that they spoke. My father used to always say that it's really one of the real advantages of falling in love when you don't have a common language. So they did fall in love, and they got married, and 9 months later, my sister was born in Jaffa. Now, my sister was very sickly as a baby, and in the new state, There were shortages of everything. There were shortages of food, of medicine, even milk for children, for babies. Now, if you saw my sister today, you would think she is anything other than she was anything other than a sickly infant, because she is a robust, powerful, amazing woman. She would have been here tonight, but she caught a bad cold, so she couldn't make it. Thank you, Wanda. I knew I'd get a laugh from someone like that. Okay? So my parents decided that because of my sister's health, they would have to move back to my mother's home in Winnipeg, Canada, and they decided they needed to do this, so they said, okay, let's do it. And they had to go through Paris first, through France, because my father was Moroccan, and the French controlled the immigration in Morocco, and the new state of Israel hadn't yet had time to set up any immigration thing. There was really nothing set up at all, so they were able to get to Paris, and my father could apply for immigration to Canada from there. They spent a month in Paris, and evidently my sister, who is now a toddler, according to my parents, charmed the entire city of Paris with how cute she was and all that. My parents had a lovely, beautiful time for 1 month. And by the way, during that 1 month, I was conceived in Paris, so we know they had to have some kind of a good time. And then off my mother went to Winnipeg with her daughter. She didn't quite realize that she had something else cooking as well, but and my father remained in Paris until he got his immigration papers. When my mom arrived in Winnipeg, her family was very happy to see her, but they had some concerns and some questions as well. Here this woman had left, their daughter, their sister had left, but 3 years earlier as a single woman, went off on this adventure, comes back 3 years later, a mere 3 years later. She's towing a 1.5-year-old little girl, and by the way, no husband, although she claims to be married to someone from Africa, who they had never even seen, they knew nothing about. They had just basically read about him in some letter that she had sent. I'm sure they had never met anyone from Morocco, and probably they had very little exposure to a Sephardic Jew in any event. But they were concerned that there was no husband here, that she had showed up with a 1.5-year-old. Of course, it only got worse as the months went by, and my mother realized that she was pregnant, and she started showing, so that got worse. Well, my father's back in Paris, waiting for his papers to come through, and they finally come through, and he arrives in Winnipeg, January 1952, 3 days before I was born. Now, he was absolutely thrilled to be there. He was happy to be reunited with his wife. He was thrilled to be able to see his 2-year-old daughter and to be there for the birth of a son and a Brit Milah that was going to happen 8 days later. So it was just a wonderful time. He hadn't quite sorted out that there was a little bit of animosity that he would have to work his way through. And because he didn't realize that, he immediately turned to his in-laws to talk about a problem that was gnawing at him, that he needed their help with. What was that problem? He had his entire family in Morocco, and they needed to come out. And he looked at Winnipeg. I'm sure the greeting he got by the weather in January in Winnipeg, Manitoba was not the best, but he figured Morocco is not where these Jews need to be. I need to bring them here. So he went to his in-laws, and his in-laws, who were already a little disconcerted over having one Moroccan in Winnipeg, they were not that excited about helping out, bringing in more, nor did they think it was even possible. The fact is, it took my father 8 months, and he was married to a Canadian. How could he think of getting his family in? And by the way, they asked how many people you think